you don't fall off a cliff overnight. You drift one day at a time, right?
Yeah.
One day at a time. And if you don't hold on to what do I really value, and your 3 V's here, like what if we don't, we will drift without realizing it.
I said, yeah, there has to be something more to life than this. So I decided to give it one more go and really apply myself. It snowballed. Once you start to achieve something, small wins here and there, you start to realize you're not entirely worthless. And then it becomes more about, if you have the why, the want, the rest is easier. Opportunity doesn't waste time with the unprepared.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's another key. There are always opportunities. But are you ready to move on it? Are you ready to expose yourself to that vulnerability if it goes wrong? Ready to, to acquire the skill sets or challenge yourself to get, to acquire new skill sets quickly, to measure up, to take advantage of that opportunity when it arises. And I think they're all things that increase what we call luck, opportunity and outcomes. Silence is a very, very powerful tool when it comes to communication. The ability to shut up and listen.
Hi, Zandy. My observation is that many of us have a complicated relationship with success. Some have it, but they can't see it, while others see it, but they can't appreciate it. And many of us are surprised to find that it doesn't bring as much fulfillment as we had expected. But with the right perspective and mindset, all of us can learn how to enjoy not just the destination, but the journey to success as well. That's the idea behind the book we're going to talk about in this episode. Adrian Kelly joins us to talk about his new book, The Success Complex. It's a book that blends history and behavioral science with interviews and case studies to give us what I believe are unique insights into what success really looks like. Could it be that a once struggling student who languished at the bottom of his class can teach us practical lessons about success? Well, you're going to find out. I can't wait to share the discussion with you. A quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week, and it's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Adrian about his new book, The Success Complex. Adrian, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Hi, Andy. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you so much. Before we get into ideas from the book, I'm interested in learning more about your formative years, okay? Is there anything from your family culture or experiences growing up that formed kind of how you thought of success back then, and maybe how your view of success is different from your vantage point these days?
Whoa, straight in there. That's a big question.
Yeah.
Growing up in Ireland, I grew up in the 1980s, 70s child. The 1980s Ireland was a very depressed era. We lived right on the border. And it was a hard border back then. It was a militarized zone, pretty much. So we lived about a mile from the kind of the tanks and guns. So it was quite a strange era when you look back, because today there's no evidence of that whatsoever in Ireland. You wouldn't know that ever existed. But it led to a very polarized society, and also perhaps a very polarized view of normality, in the sense that, not polarized, but obscured view of normality, because we accept what we find, don't we? We've no reference point other than that. We only had, like, whatever it was, 5 channels on the TV, and the only reason we had 5 channels was because we were right close to the UK, as people would say. And before those channels were from the UK. So if I lived further south, we only had 2 channels on the TV. So that's your extent of the window to the outside world. So in terms of your view of success, I guess what people would expect, people would hold success synonymous with material success, or notoriety, or fame of some sort, sporting success. I think that is probably true today as well for a large number of people. But I spent the last number of years, maybe a lifetime, trying to examine that question, because I started, as you mentioned, from quite a low base. I was pretty much a disaster academically when it came to school. My mother passed away when I was 10 years old, and I kind of went into this spiral. I moved with my granny for 3 years, and then I came back to high school, as you'd call it. And I suppose I kind of, without getting into psychoanalysis, probably carried a lot of anger of my mother's death or whatever, and just had a lot of disinterest in life and achievement, and bumped along, at the bottom of the class academically. And those bumps were pretty big, because if people don't think you care, suddenly they don't care very much about your success or what you achieve. And it was only when I reached 16, 17, 18 that I decided to address that and try and change that, try and change my story a little. And, I hit pretty rock bottom working in factories and stuff and was considering leaving school without even doing my final exams. But, factory work certainly changes your perspective in life. Particularly shift work where you're doing 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, which we were in turkey factories and stuff leading up to Christmas. And I said, yeah, there has to be something more to life than this. So I decided to give it one more go and really apply myself. And, it snowballed. Once you start to achieve something, small wins here and there, you start to realize you're not entirely worthless and that you do have the capability to do something. And then it becomes more about if you have the why, if you have the why, the want, the rest is easier. I think even in the early 1990s in Ireland, when there weren't a lot of resources, people want to help people who want to help themselves. Is my opinion. When I went back and repeated my Leaving Cert, which is your high school diploma or whatever would be the equivalent in the States, I had a very good headmaster, the principal of the school, who let me back in to do it, and he gave me a couple of pep talks, and he said one of the things he said to me was, the people that are successful in life are the people that have bottle, and that puzzled me for years. What is bottle? Yeah. Bottle, and what he meant was the nerve, the people that could hold their nerve and apply themselves consistently to an outcome. And I think that's very true today, even after writing the book. I use the concept, or I talk about stick-to-itness, which is a phrase I've heard elsewhere. It's not my phrase. Sure. But that's the ability to kind of see something through. And I think there may be a deficit of that out there at the moment, the ability to stick at things, because we're in such an instant world of satisfaction that the ability to grind stuff out and see it through, even when it's not going well. I think that is, that's a really important skill, Yeah. But you also need role models in life. One of my greatest role models, I have my father, of course, who spent all his life in Clonus, but his brother spent all his life in Asia building this big business. And he'd come home every Christmas, driving the big car and, wearing the suit. And he was a great role model to kind of reference. There's somebody that got out of Clonus back in the 50s and turned his life around and built this big business and had all the kind of, certainly the trappings of success, but was also had this really positive, jovial outlook in life. And I was like, yeah, I want some of that. I want to be that guy. How can I be that guy? Because it wasn't anybody else I knew in my life that was like that, Yeah. So I think those two things are really important. One is the why. Secondly is developing that stick-to-itness. And thirdly, having something to aim at, a role model of somebody that actually got out and did something with their lives.
That's good, because there are role models. Actually, there are models of people who might hit what we might call success, but they're miserable. Right?
Yeah.
Or I suppose there's always sacrifices of some sorts. As one mentor said, you're always cheating something. You're always cheating something. There are trade-offs, right? But when you see a model like that of somebody who, man, that set of trade-offs, I think I could deal with, right? That's pretty inspiring. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been many decades since I graduated from what we call high school, but I enjoy going back to class reunions. And I live about maybe a 3-hour drive from there, so it's not too hard to get back. But one of my favorite parts, Adrian, is running into people who were far from the top of the class. I mean, some of them, we might call them goofballs. Like they just didn't take any of it serious, but they turned out to be quite successful. And you talk about IQ in your book. So how much does IQ, as we normally think about it, influence later success? And why is Point Guard Quotient a bit more interesting to you?
Yeah, great question. I mean, all people talked about, certainly the reference point for intelligence or potential success was IQ when I grew up. You did IQ tests at school and stuff. But I wanted to really dive into that and see, where does that come from, this concept of IQ? And it turns out that it was Alfred Binet, who was a success, who was a French psychometrician, developed the IQ test not to measure intelligence, but to see what deficits people had in the learning system in France in the early 1900s. And so that was the purpose of the test. But it became, I would say, it later became misused as some sort of measure of potential, which is incredibly mistaken, by the way. Because it's like testing all your athletes with the 100-meter sprint. It's like line them all up and let's see what they can do. It's just it's some things are really hard to measure. People talk about EQ, emotional intelligence, which is is very important, has its part to play. But Malcolm Gladwell, who I kind of I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell, but he writes in his book Outliers about this analogy of basketball players and how tall they can be. One of the greatest basketball players in history, if not the greatest, Michael Jordan, was 6'6". 6'6" is a pretty good height. You can dunk quite easily, you can jump, you can do all these things. But if you get much taller, some people lose athleticism. Not all players, but mostly they lose some ball handling skills or athleticism. And he says it's a bit like intelligence. If your IQ is up here, say 115, 120, that's pretty good. You probably can achieve a college degree comfortably enough. You can be relatively successful. But certainly the people that he examined in his book, in terms of Oppenheimer, for example, who was probably the exception to the rule, had an IQ reportedly of 190, but had all these other skills as well, these abilities to persuade people.
Mm.
And certainly Gladwell concludes that was a learned skill. They're skills you learn, the ability to work the room, the ability to persuade people, the ability to listen and understand and develop compelling arguments. And certainly in his early life, Oppenheimer wasn't able to do that, and he needed to rely heavily on his parents. His father, Julius, for example, was a textile importer in New York and a very experienced businessman. And he helped him out a lot, particularly a scrape that he got into in Cambridge. Well, if anybody who's seen the movie where he allegedly attempted to poison one of his professors, etc., and his father helped him talk his way out of that, not Oppenheimer himself. Why talk about basketball? I thought it'd be interesting to use an analogy of point guard. The point guard is like the coach on the court, somebody that kind of feeds the offense and has great positional awareness and all these skills. But they don't need to be that tall. They can be quite short, and I talk about some examples of that. But Point Guard Quotient is an analogy I used in the book to describe the X factor, people in business that have learned these skills that weren't necessarily, they're not inherent to them, and are available to all of us with the right application and motivation to develop. And for example, I've met a lot of successful people, materially successful and financially successful, and these are people that you want to be around. They're fun. They joke a lot. They're good humorous. They enjoy people. They enjoy conversations, and you can see why they can put deals together and do deals, because people enjoy their company. They're not there just for the money or the deal or whatever else. They're there because they're interested in you. And I think it's very hard to fake that interest. I think people that are successful are genuinely interested in other people, and genuinely they're there for some sort of symmetry, some sort of synergy that they can form with the other person and do some sort of deal together, and achieve something that's not about taking something from their side of the table and having it. It's about, how can we build both sides of the table together and seize an opportunity. And I think that's the real X factor in business that I certainly have come across.
And some people may say it's EQ, but it really is different than just pure EQ, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's something more than just self-awareness. I mean, although that has to be part of it, it's something more than just adjusting to the other person. And people need to read the book to get a sense of what you mean by that. But I think it's just like a clever new angle on it that people would benefit from. It feels
exactly.
Like,
sorry, just one thing that occurred to me, and I don't name him in the book, but I met another guy who was, he's a very successful business guy, and he talked about developing rapport. And this in Ireland they would call that a bit of cuteness, where you kind of, not in a bad way, in a good way, where they would dress like appropriately, like the other people that are trying to do business with. They would try and learn the language, and they would develop, as I say, not in a way that's in a bad way, but in a way that simply makes sense, and is simply using every advantage they can to connect with that person.
Yeah.
And they're usually people that bring an early advantage to any negotiation or deal making process.
Yeah, I like it. It seems like sometimes things just work out until they don't. And you tell the story of the Challenger disaster in your book. And what is it? 9 launches into the previous 9 months had gone fine. Pressure to double the number, if I remember correctly from the book.
That's right.
And what are some lessons you've learned about success from what ended up there as a tragic disaster?
Yeah, well, I'm doing this course at the moment. I'm teaching effective communication, and I use the Challenger disaster and Stalin's Russia as some of the examples. And in the book, I said I'm always in dangerous territory when I'm trying to compare Stalin's Russia to the NASA organization, one of the most progressive, forward-thinking organizations in the world. But the end wasn't the same net result. It was that people were shouted down and not listened to,
Mm,
mostly because of an increase in anxiety and pressure.
yeah.
And that can happen in any organization, whether it's bottom up or authoritarian, pointed downwards. And certainly, I suppose that what we can learn from success in the context of NASA is the danger of pressure and how it
Mm,
changes us, and how, I'm doing this master's degree at the moment on performance psychology, and it's the level of cognition, our access to our working memories is substantially reduced when anxiety increases. And as a result, we tend to deflect to prescribe responses, conditioning. And the worse our conditioning is in terms of less training we have, in terms of our go-to responses, that usually the worse the outcomes are. So what can we learn? We can learn that the most important thing we can do is train ourselves to be prepared for opportunity. And I talk about that elsewhere in the book, of course, Napoleon and other people. Because opportunities do arise once we position ourselves correctly and are consistent and have that stick to itness. But when we're preparing to walk through that door of opportunity, it's nice to have a little foresight as to what those challenges can be when we get the other side of that door. And
yeah.
certainly, the NASA experience teaches us that the conditioned responses under pressure were not good when it came to it, regardless of the structures and systems in place.
Yeah, a guest years ago said, "We learn the long we how do you say it? We learn the wrong lessons when things go right. We think they will continue to go right." Yeah,
That's
but
right. Yeah,
yeah,
totally. Yeah,
yeah.
no, it's when things go wrong, as they say in sport, that's what you learn the most.
Well, you mentioned in the book that sustaining motivation might be
Mm,
more about avoiding demotivation. So, what do you
mm.
mean by that? And can you think of an example that illustrates that maybe from your own life?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in a roundabout way, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So the structure of the book is cut three parts. The first part of the book, 7 chapters on skills to overcome challenge, whether they're thrust upon you, whether you're sought out. The second part of the book is balance, and there's 5 chapters on that. And I talk about balance in the context of our own value system, as in how to maintain success by not get by our decision making process, and have kind of a reference point so that we don't get too far off course. But the second part of balance is about avoiding burnout. Um, and as you mentioned, maintaining motivation. And I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. And the final part of the book, just so the listeners have a full picture,
Yeah.
it's about direction. There's 3 chapters on direction, and it's in the pyramid structure, 7, 5, and 3 for a particular reason, which readers will find out about. And the last part of that book is the book. Sorry, is about what we'd like more of in our lives and what we maybe should reach for
Yeah.
in terms of outcomes, avoiding demotivation. So the core concept of the latter part of the book is really about where success joins with happiness.
Mm,
Um, so and they're very very interrelated, if not the same thing perhaps.
yeah.
And there are two concepts. One is the hedon or two principal concepts. One is hedonic happiness, where we get these endorphin hits from particular activities, which don't last very long typically. And
Yeah.
the second one is Aristotle's theory of happiness, which is eudaimonia, which is this underlying happiness, which doesn't mean laugh out loud happiness or indeed be happy at all one day or another, but it means that you're on a plan of personal growth and development. Now, in terms of avoiding demotivation, I think the single best way to avoid demotivation is to develop that path, that the path to eudaimonia, and that usually and it involves really a development of various facets, I believe, of 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 that journey, which are health. As you don't enjoy anything without your health.
Mm,
It's got to
yeah.
be core to your values.
Yeah.
That learning and I think skill acquisition and kind of growth from a skill set point of view, I find very motivating. Because you can see where it fits, and you can see the gaps, and you can see what you need to do, and typically it's not that hard to fix these things because we live in a world of information these days. And we can acquire skills really really quickly. And I talk about good being good enough as opposed to being an expert at anything. There's a wide range of being very good at things. Fantastic. I think that's probably more beneficial. And finally, spiritually, the ability to grow, and get to know ourselves, and get to understand at a deeper level the why of things is a very worthwhile path. Those three things are really really important. Um,
Yeah.
Avoiding demotivation, I think, is about typically having a plan. And
Mm.
people who are generally happier. I refer to the term happiness, which is a term I borrowed, of course, from was it Arthur C. Clarke. I think that's his name.
Mm.
Who's written a couple of books. One with Oprah Winfrey,
Mm.
and
Mm.
he talks about this reaching towards something, reaching towards. And while happiness might not be sustainable in itself, you'll have moments of hedonic happiness and satisfaction and achievement. Happiness is way more sustainable because we're reaching towards something worthwhile for you. And I think if you can spend time to eke that out, and you know, I'm researching some articles at the moment for some magazines, and one of the things I was researching very recently is meaning.
Mm.
And it may form part of book two, who knows? But uh, in terms of how to develop meaning, and one of the techniques for developing meaning, which I thought was quite interesting, and again goes right to motivation and happiness and eudaimonia and all those other things, is to identify a value. So if our value might be our family, or it might be career, or whatever it might be. The second was the vision, you know, and then the third thing was the activity. But I said we need a third V there. I prefer to say a vocation. What are we going to apply ourselves to in the long term and use that stick to itness? So value, vision, vocation. So if we take those three things for a moment, what's our value is our why. What's our vision is where we want to be, as in where do we want to get to, whatever, for that why. And third, how and in what way are we going to apply ourselves to vocate, or to apply ourselves in the long term
Yeah.
to achieve those first two things. And I think that's very, very interconnected with that eudaimonia, that have a plan, that underlying thread of personal growth, which I
Mm.
think is so important to sustain motivation.
Yeah.
If that helps answer
It
that
does.
question.
Yeah, it does. I grew up as a software developer, Adrian, and I just feel like there was always a job after that. There was always I could like drift almost
Mm,
to success, and that's different. I think in many different ways now for careers, and you know,
mm,
just trying to figure out what do we value, like how do we define success. I feel like your book does a really good job of kind of helping us get a different perspective on all that for ourselves, and I feel like I'm attracted to any conversation about identity, and you talk in the book about a tangled identity. And
mm,
so I'd be interested in what do you mean by a tangled identity and how has that impacted you
mm.
personally?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a great example. I qualified as a solicitor or a lawyer, as you would say in the States,
Yeah.
Partly, I suppose, when I look back on it, for two reasons. One is because I felt I was so worthless at school and academia for
Mm.
many, many years. I kind of wanted to prove to myself that I could do
Mm.
something worthwhile. And studying law and becoming a solicitor or a lawyer seemed up there in most people's perspective as something that, well, generally you're not an idiot if you can pass the
Right.
the law, the professional exams, and
Yeah.
I work really hard and excelled at those, and ended up teaching where an exam and being an examiner actually, where those solicitors were coming out and qualifying. But when I got into practice, then I was in a country practice and I moved around a little bit. Had a great experience, did a lot of criminal work and defense work, and enjoyed it and developed great skill sets, etc., etc. One thing I observed a lot of was this identification. So you're a small town solicitor lawyer, you've got your name over the door,
Hmm.
parents are very proud, you're this pillar of society, so to speak, very, very respected. But the problem with small law firms, particularly in Ireland, is they're way overregulated for
Mm.
what small law firms are capable of doing. And because the Law Society in Ireland take a view that, well, we prefer more amalgamated firms. We'd like them to kind of merge, And as a result of all this compliance, and people probably won't believe me when they say this, they do struggle with profitability because they
Mm.
don't train lawyers as business people. They train
Ah,
them to
right.
practice law.
Yeah.
And running the back office is time consuming. The regulatory aspect is also time consuming and stressful. And what people cannot get out of it because not only do you need to, there are barriers to exit. One of being 6 years runoff insurance. You have to pay the special indemnity insurance of 15,000 quid a year, and you kind of tails off over a 6 year period. That's a big sum. That's got to eat into your. Then you've got all those redundancies to make people redundant. Your staff, usually surrounded by a team. But thirdly, and most importantly, and I talk about this in the context of sport, Marty Fish, a tennis player, etc., etc. Um, People become so identified with being Adrian Kelly, the solicitor,
Mm.
that they can't see themselves as anything else anymore. And, to be anything else is a failure in their eyes and in the eyes of somebody else. Now you're a failed solicitor. You had to close your practice because, well, it didn't work out. And there are many professions like that, I think, where people lose sight of, lose that agility to ruthlessly reappraise what's working for them in their lives anymore. And certainly if they know it, they lack the courage to act on it for a variety of reasons. And I think the moment that you embrace that and act on it, you'll suddenly find that nobody cares.
Right.
Nobody cares, and you can absolutely live with that, and it's much worse to live with a career or some sort of station in life that isn't working for you. That's much tougher. Rather than just taking those steps and getting out. And you know what? It's liberating. It's suddenly now, my career trajectory, and people looking at it from the outside might say, well, this guy's been in a variety of careers. Does he really know what he wants? But funny enough, right through my whole career trajectory, there's been this thread of development, as I would see it, where I always saw new opportunities and a reason to do something different. So, after 6 years of practicing law as a criminal solicitor, we had the downturn here in Ireland around 2007, 2008. Global, crisis, of course, financial crisis. I met a friend of mine, and my uncle, who was, the guy who spent his life in Asia, said, one conversation could change your life, Adrian. He said it to me one time. And one conversation did, because I met this guy who wanted the largest patent and renewable energy and blah, blah. So I teamed up with him, and, a couple of years later, we had employed 30 people, and we were in the renewable energy business. I was no longer as a practicing solicitor anymore. I left, I transitioned out of it. And, I developed this worldwide portfolio of patents and developed this technology, and we sold products out of China into America, et cetera, et cetera. A whole different career trajectory. And I did that for 10 years. And I left in 2018. And I said, what's next? And a lot of the attempt was to go back into private practice. I said, no, I'm not doing that because I've done it. It's not going to grow me anymore. 6 years in anything, you're on that. It's kind of the same stuff again after a while, as you know. So I said, I'd really like to kind of hone the skills that I've kind of learned and observed and try and, share them around other people. That kind of idea appealed to me. And at that time, it was more kind of legal, taxation, customs was the sort of stuff I was familiar with. So I started to do that for the government and work with, some big law firms, providing training to them, etc. And then as that developed, you always got to have your eyes open. I really got, as I spoke to more and more people, we did about 100 businesses. During Brexit, I was an advisor, during Brexit for businesses employed on contract with the government. We did 100, 150 businesses over 18 months, 2 years. But the more I got to talk to people, the more interested I got as to how the hell did you end up in this business? It kind of, what was your journey? So I started to kind of get more into the why of things. And then that brought me again closer to the psychology aspect, which I'm currently in the book and the master's degree, et cetera, on why we do anything. And life is so short. And why do we make those decisions? And why do we trap ourselves? Because there's nobody traps us like ourselves.
Right.
Nobody else can do that to us, only ourselves. And so I love this idea of liberation, skill development, pushing the envelope, getting right outside that comfort zone and doing something completely different. And and it may go horribly wrong at times. You just have to, but that's part of the process.
That's right.
That is part of the process. And I talk about my octopus teacher, that in the book, on Netflix, and also an analogy that Josh Waitzkin uses in his book, The Art of Learning, which is also a wonderful book. And he talks about the hermit crab, and it can't grow any bigger unless it finds a bigger shell. And it has to march it, bring its mushy self out of the shell and crawl along the seafloor, and it's suddenly exposed to all these predators, and everything can go wrong. But when it finds that bigger shell, suddenly it grows, And when we talk about earlier, I talked about skill set growth, personal growth, relationship growth, whatever. All those things are about creating space for those things to grow. And the more we consume ourselves with all the hours that God sends in one career or another, the less time we have to think about where that space can come from. And sometimes it's nice to have a blank sheet and go, what's next? And I'm open to allow opportunity to come in, and I'm also open to acquiring the skills that's going to take me to deliver on that opportunity for me.
There's probably exceptions to this, Adrian, but I feel like even when it doesn't feel like it is a natural progression, nothing's wasted. Like when you went to that renewable energy, you weren't a solicitor, but the skills you had developed, I have to think,
Yeah,
applied. And so what might seem like we're taking a turn, actually, by staying open, we're actually, nothing gets wasted, right?
that's right. Yeah, totally. They're totally transferable skills, particularly
Yeah.
presentation skills
Yeah.
and people skills. They're just skills for life. You need
Hmm.
those. And I remember in the court, we used to go down to the court to do criminal cases, and we used to have 25 cases a day. Most of those were just plead guilty. Some of them
Yeah.
were contests, but
Yeah.
sometimes you just have a phone number on your hand, not even a name. You go down, and some guys comes out, he's handing you a pile of summonses or charge sheets. He's been arrested, he needs a bail application or else, and all of it is think on your feet,
Yeah.
boom, 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 and
Yeah.
manage people, negotiate with the police or the guards, as they call them now. And I love that. It was terrifying, but it was high octane,
Right.
and and the learning curve was that you
Yeah.
had to get somebody's in cuffs. There's hundreds of people in the court.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Next, can you
But
get this guy a bail?
you probably learned to read patterns. That's a pattern. That's a pattern. And you're a pattern matcher then, right? And you'd learn to recognize those things. So
You
yeah.
do, yeah, certainly do. There are touch points which are similar,
Yeah.
and and also observing other solicitors and mistakes they make are invaluable as well. And say,
Hmm.
wow, learning from other people's mistakes is an
Yeah.
absolutely is an absolute key. Don't go out and make all those mistakes yourself. Keep your eyes
Yeah.
open and watch mistakes other people make, and don't
Yeah.
make the same ones.
Sometimes I feel like I'm the one who has to touch the stove to find out it's hot instead of learning from somebody else. Yeah. But
That's right.
uh,
Yeah, I know that
you know,
feeling.
those of us leading projects sometimes feel like, oh, we could run into bad luck. Sometimes things go wrong. And even though we try to do risk management, we say we could not have foreseen those. So do you personally believe it's possible to increase your luck? And if so, how do you try to do that for yourself?
Yeah, well, as you know, I've got a chapter there called "Increasing Your Luck" in the book, and it's kind of provocative because people
Yeah.
would say, "Well, luck is luck. You're either lucky, you're unlucky. You get the breaks, you don't get the breaks." But I certainly believe, certainly from what other people might perceive from a third-party perspective, go, that person is very lucky to get all these opportunities. I never get those opportunities. Well, there are ways to create opportunities and position yourself for opportunities. Absolutely. I mean, my favorite chapter, as the author of the book, is probably that story about the local school principal when she was 10 years old in Belfast in 1983. A very kind of fractious, difficult, bombed out city with all this, chaos around her. And her family were very poor. And she spots this bicycle in the window, and there's a draw to win the bicycle. So you're going to need some luck to win a draw. But she sees the bicycle, and she she can't afford this bicycle, but she really wants it. And her and her younger sister decide on this plan to win this bicycle. And I just think it's absolutely a true story. She just told me this story one day. I was speaking to her, and I was like blown away. I can't believe it. I was like, there's so many learnings in there. And so what she did was she discovered that to enter the draw in the supermarket to win the bicycle, you had to complete this phrase, shop at crazy prices because dot 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 dot. And a lot of people who are busy, parents, wherever else, they do the shopping, they get handed the form, and they'd leave it behind them because it's just too much effort to think of a phrase to write out. What she was doing was she had the time at the perfection. She would hang around and wait for these to be lying around, that she'd get them and fill them out and throw them in the in the draw box or whatever. And she did that every day for 6 weeks at this 2 mile journey with her younger sister, and won the bicycle. And I just thought, well, yeah, wow, like what a way to position yourself for opportunity and success. And we can all learn so much from that kid as she was back then, which is that ability to keep showing up every day, that
Mm.
ability to observe things. There's a weak point in the system. It doesn't
Yeah.
cost me anything. Then
Mm.
then there's the ability to walk through that door of opportunity. To have the neck to go up and fill out that form and not go, hey kid, what are you doing there? To risk that sort of reaction from the shop, which never
Yeah.
came. And ultimately, to have all those. I said, well, how many would you have filled out? Probably 20 a day. 20 a day for 6 weeks really puts you at a big advantage.
Yeah.
So now she said, well, maybe the shopkeeper saw her come in and made sure she won the draw. Who knows? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because you know what? As I said, people help those who help themselves.
Mm.
They like to see people that are up for something, up for a challenge, particularly a young person. They'll go out of the way to help them, and and it's just showing other people that you've got got that stick-to-itness and ability to show up and ability to deliver on something. In the same chapter, I talk about Napoleon using the fog to his advantage, which is much more strategic. The fog may never have came, but he withdrew his forces. The fog did come. It was an area, the Pratsian Heights in modern-day Czech Republic, which was prone to fog. So, he was working the obvious advantages of the local topography, for sure. But it did show up. And when it showed up, he had his troops ready to go, ready to mobilize, ready to take full advantage. And I think that's another key aspect. As in, and I think there's a quote in the book that says something like, opportunity doesn't waste time with the unprepared. And I think that's another key one. It's, there are always opportunities, but are you ready to move on it? Are you ready, ready to expose yourself to that vulnerability if it goes wrong? Ready to, to acquire the skill sets or challenge yourself to get, to acquire new skill sets quickly to measure up, to take advantage of that opportunity when it arises, and I think they're all things that increase what we call luck, opportunity and outcomes.
Do I remember that section that there's also awareness of our biases? Because the biases might actually reduce our surface area for luck, right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, I mentioned earlier, and this is this is probably newer information, but I've done a lot of research lately on bias because of performance psychology, in terms of instructing athletes and how we perceived and preferred communication channels. And there are so many visors of the way we look at the world, our own personal conditioning, growing up, how we see the world. But then there's all sorts of variables that people are not aware of, and one of those which I've been looking at lately is communication styles, so visual, audio, kinesthetic, read, write preferences. So let's say we've all got 4 antennas. Usually 1 or 2 are bigger than the others. Now, if we've got, a preferred communication style, it means that the person that we're communicating with has a preferred communication style. What is that? So we can take a lot of the mystery away in terms of outcomes and results by tooling ourselves up in terms of how to understand the world that we're trying to communicate in. Because very often we try and communicate in our own goldfish bowl and wonder why it's not landing in the other goldfish bowl over there. Yeah. And we got to start communicating in their world, in that goldfish bowl, to try and really get a result. And there's a great book on that as well by Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference. You've probably come across it. The FBI negotiator, where he talks about the FBI listening team. They've got these listeners. One's just listening for positive words, one listening for negative words, one listening for the tone of the words, the spacing of the words, because all of this information is available to us. But we're too busy talking or thinking about what we're going to say next, rather than actually listening to the person across from us, which will usually get us a much better result. Silence is a very, very powerful tool when it comes to communication. The ability to shut up and listen. So, we talk about biases. There's all sorts of biases and variables out there which distort our ability to land where we want to land from an information communication point of view. And communication is everything, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to, success and deal making and progress and relationships and, so much. It's really worth working on ourselves and learning about what those distortions look like and how we can limit those distortions and get that frequency tuned in properly. Just like my example earlier we talked about the Point Guard Quotient and the ability to kind of connect with other people by using their language and talking in their goldfish bowl over here, and trying to really reach out and get that connection.
Yeah, we might say they're just lucky, but there was that combination of skills that actually develop the rapport, like you talked about, and actually make things possible. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you know what? Simple things like smiling, body language. You actually want to be there in the room with the person. You're not there just to get their business or whatever. It's there. You're there because you're interested in them. You're there because you want to grow your own social network, your relationships. You want to grow you with them. You want to grow your business with them and succeed together. And and that's kind of where the book ends up a little bit in terms of outcomes. In terms of certainly what I'd recommend success should be.
When you and I are recording this, it's kind of the peak of the basketball season in college. And I recently heard a college basketball coach say, it's impossible to be a present husband and father while being a successful college coach. He literally used the word impossible, which might be a bias, by the way, or just a skewed thing. But anyway, what are your thoughts about the balance between like the all-out effort to improve as well, but also balancing that with sustaining well-being.
I love that question, because that's a question that just affects just about everybody that's in a high octane career, or on a career ladder, or a trajectory that's challenging. It's and we can only do so much in our lives, and we spread ourselves too thin. We're no good to anybody, particularly ourselves. And I think that really comes back to those three V's that we talked about earlier. The value, the why. Why would I do that? Where is that for me? The vision is, how good do I want to be at that? And the vocation. And the vocation is probably where this is at, as in, how am I willing to apply myself? And, we don't hear this word enough. And what am I willing to sacrifice to get it? So something has to give. Something is not going to get done. Another opportunity is not going to get pursued. I'm going to drop some other ball, and it's better to drop it early and decide that an advantage, so you're not letting people down. And that's the hard part, isn't it? But that goes back to those first 2 points. Value, how important is it to me?
Yeah.
Vision, how good do I want to be at it? And sometimes good is good enough. And I certainly am a believer, and it's totally a personal decision. In the balance I like to have is a variety of learning, a variety of experiences, a variety of stepping through those opportunities in a project format. So you got a couple of projects going. It's always interesting. It's always challenging. But it can be dangerous to be so consumed by one thing. It kind of, you can lose sight of what's important. I was watching a show on TV last night, Lego Masters Australia. My kids love Lego, particularly my son. And they built this massive. You've seen Lego Masters,
Absolutely.
Lego Masters. Yeah, it's absolutely world class. This kind of yacht this guy built. It was like these little miniature figures, and But the guy says, what? It's beautiful. It's fantastic. He said, but the problem is, you've lost sight. There's a big hole in the front of the ship. He's just a Lego couldn't quite fit together. He's like, yeah. But look at all the miniature figures inside and blah blah. And quite often life's like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes we miss the hole in the ship, the big important things to us that we can't see anymore because we're blinded by the minutiae of something that has consumed us, not by choice. Sometimes success in some career or sporting career can bring that on without us realizing, and suddenly we're the guys that are or ladies that are focusing on the minutiae in the ship rather than realizing there's a hole in the side of the ship.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
From an analogy perspective, I think that's very interesting. I think we're all guilty of that to an extent, and I think it's that cognitive ability to take that step back and say, well, hang on, what does the whole picture look like at the moment?
Yeah.
Is there balance in my life? Is it the way I want it to be?
And sometimes it's hard to see, because I feel like watching friends' marriages fall apart, or relationships with their kids fall apart. And I'm not saying this from a point of judgment. My observation is, you don't fall off a cliff overnight. You drift one day at a time, right? Yeah. One day at a time. And if you don't hold on to, what do I really value? And your three V's here, like, what if we don't, we will drift without realizing it, right?
Totally. Yeah. Totally. And, I talk in the book as well about Richie Barber, who's the Special Forces Army guy. We're at the Army camp with all these players when I was coaching last year with a kind of elite Gaelic football team. And Richie, they're carrying these sandbags up this dune, and they're after running with these bags. And some of them got stretchers and they're carrying these. And he says, everybody stop. He says, do you want to put some of the gear down? And everybody's like, no, because it's like they think it's some sort of test, So on the go. So I said to Richie, I said, well, would you have let them put it down if they'd wanted to put it down? He was like, depends on the answer. He said, because if they wanted to put it down because they were tired, no. If they wanted to put it down because they were looking ahead to the train, they were saying, do we need all this gear? Is it going to risk injury? A very kind of a proper kind of evaluation of what lies ahead. He said, yes, I would, because we are training soldiers to reevaluate things ruthlessly. And he says the difference between special forces soldiers and regular infantry is that they've got a set of parameters, not a set of orders, and they can decide ruthlessly how to achieve those objectives. And quite often we lose sight of that in life, in terms of to do that kind of stock take, that quick analysis of, okay, is everything in my life still working for me to get to those whys, to get to those the values that are really important to me. And, we just don't do that. And if we do it, back to the identity, intertwined identity, are we willing
Mm.
to act on it? Are we willing to act on it? Particularly in business, things get complicated in business because you're surrounded by a team, some people you like more than others, whatever it might be. And then suddenly, you realize one day that some departments aren't quite fit for purpose anymore. The business has moved on, the landscape's changed, blah, blah. But I can't let go of Bob. Bob's been here since the beginning. Suddenly where it's our relationships kick in and we can't make those tough decisions, and that's fine. Make them, don't make them. But unfortunately, from an objective point of view, the ability to step back and look at it,
Mm.
that's not working anymore. That's no good for Bob, and it's no good for you. Bob should probably be off doing something else if he's doing something that isn't adding a lot of value where he is for his life journey. We don't often see that. We go, no, I want the Bob, we got to keep him on board, blah, blah, blah. And I think there's dangers there. And, we think we know everything at times, and, it's other people's life journeys are much better adding value somewhere else. They've got a different path to follow sometimes in
Yeah.
life.
Oh, yeah, so true. There's so
Mm.
many things in the book. Like I'm going to hit this one because you talk about this notion of autonomy deprivation, and I never heard that before. So I'm interested from your take of why is it such an important concept for us to understand for our own lives, but also for the people we lead.
Yeah, so just to explain that concept, we
Yeah.
have this 996 culture in China, which the style of the book is to look at extreme examples to bring the point home, to make it, stand out vividly.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to kind of, with each chapter, deliver a point. And the point is not chapter control or a lack of control, as the case may be.
Mm.
Now, in the 996 culture, which is work 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, which is the typical working week apparently in these big tech companies in China, they have a thing called Bafu Singaye, which is bedtime revenge procrastination. So people are so deprived of their personal time. Everything they do is measured in these big warehouses or whatever. They scan things and they know where they are all the time, the big brother stuff. When they get home at 10 p.m., they go, the hell with this. I'm going to have some personal time. I'm going to play some video games and watch some Netflix, whatever else. Suddenly it's 3 a.m. in the morning. They don't get enough sleep. They're at it again the next day. And that substantially reduces your kind of lifespan and your health outcomes. So that's autonomy deficiency. Even if you're not in that, on that treadmill, it's our iPhones, our smartphones, I should say, or our technology now, which is baying for our attention at every point.
Yeah.
And I think that what we probably have is attention deficit as well. We suffer from, authentic attention, as in the practice of attention. Now, I'm been listening to a little bit of the Waking Up app, the mindfulness stuff, and there's some
Mhm.
really interesting talks on there in terms of the ability to actually focus on anything
Mm.
with quality attention anymore. But it's not only good for relationships and actually listening to people and being there in the conversation without your phone being in the middle of things or scrolling or whatever else. Or, he uses in one of the talks an example of old friends meet up. They meet up after 5 years and they're all sitting around the table on their phones. They may as well be anywhere.
Right.
So it's a world that's squeezing that squeezing us from a control point of view, but it's also squeezing us from our ability to be attentive to anything in a quality way anymore. And I think but there are ways of pushing back, and they're nothing to do with money.
Mm.
Usually, it's getting off somebody else's diary. It's developing the ability to say no. It's developing the ability to reorganize calls and meetings to suit your time frame a bit better. It's the recognition of the importance to have that me time, that personal time, for a period every day, and to spend that time of, talk about silence earlier in terms of
Uh-huh.
negotiation and communication. Silence and peace are actually very, very important for ourselves as well. Just time to be and relax and kind of let things settle. There was this old analogy many years ago of the beach. It was like this guy had sand and water in a jar and he wanted to see the beach, so he kept shaking the jar to see the beach. He kept shaking it. In the end, he gets tired, puts it down, goes to sleep, and wakes up and sees the jar, and there's the beach in the jar. The sediment is settled at the bottom of the water. The more you keep shaking that jar, or pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and not allowing time, skills to bed in, things that people say, allowed to listen and absorb it, or just allow time for ourselves to be healthier and have that peace of mind and get off other people's diaries, the less likely you are to see that beach, unfortunately.
Mm. Mm. I'm to the point where if I don't get time on my bike or if I don't get time for a walk, it it feels like it substantially hurts my day
Yeah,
because there's this time I've purposely, like on a bike, I can't be playing with electronics. I suppose on a walk I could, but we're depriving of that, right? And just getting that step away, and it's just so good mental health wise, and some of my best ideas come, while I'm out doing that.
that's right. Simon Sinek talks about this example. He talks about the woodcutter. And he says, there's two woodcutters, they're chopping wood all day long. One guy disappears for an hour a day and comes back and still chops more wood than the other guy. And the other guy can't understand this. And so eventually he gets the courage to ask the guy, how come you chop more wood? I do 8 hours, you do 7 hours every day. He said, yeah, well, I take an hour off, I go home and I sharpen my axe.
Mm. Yeah.
And we just don't take time to sharpen our axe anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe, take more time to do that. We have better outcomes.
Yeah. There's so many things I'd love to talk with you about, Adrian, but let's end with this. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast. Can you think of any things that you and your wife did or do to help prepare your 4 children for a successful life ahead?
Wow. Well, you started with a tough question. You've ended on a tough question, Andy. Yeah, I mean, the role of parents now, it's probably more difficult than ever. Because back in the 1980s, I started off describing my upbringing. It was like, go outside the door and come back at 6 o'clock for your tea. Now we're, the world is so intrusive. It's on the phones, it's on the TV, it's on, it's in so many different devices. It's all around us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if there's one thing we can do, and I'm all about kind of figuring out what's the one thing that we can do to make all the difference, is probably just education. It's to listen to the kids and try and educate them as best we can to upskill them with the tools they need to make good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not easy. That's a process. And it's also a matter of having an open enough relationship, and this is really difficult stuff, for them to come back and confide in you and say, what went right, what went wrong, what scares you, what's not working for you, because it's an iterative process. It's you got to let them fail a little bit, come back and talk about it and see how we can improve things, and poke them along to kind of get those skills and try and acquire those skills and try and at least have the bedrock of what good decisions look like, because we don't always make good decisions, any of us. So it's about trying to give them those tools and to make the best decisions for themselves, which I know is probably a watery answer, but it's that's the best I can come up with.
Well, I feel like sometimes there's so much focus on the grade, almost on the IQ part, without really developing the point guard quotient part.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's the thing. It's a different society now in terms of getting to where you want to be. I mean, back then, if I didn't get the results when I repeated that, my final exams, I was going back to the turkey factory. There wasn't much other option for me, Whereas now, nobody has to really work on the turkey factory. There's lots of ways, even if you do screw up your final exam second time around, whatever situation you're in, for stepping stones to where you want to get to. And sometimes they're better stepping stones. Sometimes, for example, you've got this whole... in Ireland, you've got these stepping stone courses now. Instead of getting the Leaving Cert going to university or going to college, you can do this a year now at a local college. And that's such a good thing, because it allows the person to mature. It allows them to kind of get a taste of what they're in for when they actually do go to college, and the outcomes tend to be a lot better because they have that bedrock here of kind of get a foundational knowledge and then move on. So I suppose my point is, the drawbacks, what people might perceive as knockbacks in life, aren't always knockbacks. They can be real advantages, and it's this, this cognitive reappraisal and so on. And in psychology, you talk about cognitive reframing in sports. This is not a setback. This is actually an opportunity to show people how I can react to this.
Yeah.
The character I have. I want to show people how hard I'm going to work. I'm going to show that coach, he's benched me. I'm going to show him how hard I work and what a great team player I am, and how I'm going to encourage the team from the bench, and how I'm going to, I'm going to train even harder and show them what I got. That's cognitive reframing, and we can use that for anything. See it as an opportunity. How does that word opportunity now fit into your situation? Where's the opportunity? Is a great question to ask.
That's a great question. For those listening, even though we talked for a while, we barely touched on ideas from Adrian's book. If you'd like a hopeful, I would say, thought-provoking book on success, check out The Success Complex. I put links to the book and Adrian's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Adrian, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
It's been a real pleasure, Andy. And it's available on audiobook, of course, as well, for those that don't have the time.
Yeah.
to read books anymore.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well said. Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you, Andy.
Special thanks to Adrian for joining us here on the People and Projects podcast. I think it's an insightful book, and I think it's, say, notably different than a lot of the books that I get pitched from publishers and authors. Adrian's a great storyteller. I mean, really, really good storyteller, and has this absolutely fascinating blend of history and personal anecdotes to make it an interesting read. And the fact that he's from outside the US, I think actually is a helpful cultural perspective as well. Some things I took away from it include just be careful about the stories we tell ourselves. We talked about a little bit during the interview about how he was not the highest, scoring person in school. And I think we tend to measure the wrong things. And I think we can easily start telling ourselves things like, oh, I'm not a good test taker. I hear that with people preparing for the PMP. Oh, I'm not a good test taker. Or, well, I can't handle that pressure. Or, we just tell ourselves these stories. And I think part of it is because we were told those stories, maybe, but I think we too easily base things on like IQ, and we don't think about the other aspects that can really help somebody be successful. So be careful about the stories you tell yourselves, and for that matter, about other people that you might be telling those stories. I think that what the book does effectively is help you and me think about what does success mean to us? And we talked a little bit about it during the interview of, are we starting to drift? Just one day at a time, are we starting to drift? And I just know personally that it's so easy, if I'm not careful, to sacrifice well-being because I love what I do so much. I mean, the podcast isn't my job. I'm pretty full, schedule teaching and speaking at places and things like that. But I do this too because it feeds each other. But I just have to make sure that I'm not drifting away from, being distracted with my family and not able to spend time with friends and other meaningful things. So the book will help you think that through if you pick up a copy. I feel like there's a theme in the book about how doing, stretching things like difficult situations or, attempting the impossible often brings out our best. It's the idea of stretching ourselves, which I know in theory makes sense, right? For a lot of us, but the idea of it's easy to start getting complacent if we're not careful. Keep this in mind about upcoming challenges. It's those challenges that really do grow us and that we'll often remember later on. So I think this is a good reminder in the book of what we know is true, but it's so easy to just drift towards complacency. There was a line in the book about how we overestimate talent and underestimate persistence. And he talked a little bit about the stick-to-itiveness in the interview. And, there's this interesting challenge of when do we keep going and when do we quit? And we've had some episodes on that topic. But I think where I've seen in my own life is there's certain areas I've got talent, but I got to tell you, so much of my success, I personally believe, is persistence. And I think that's probably true for you in some ways. So once again, I think it's good for us to be reminded of that. And also, there's some fun philosophical discussions about luck. And he talked a little bit about it. He's got a whole chapter on it in the book. But I think there is something about this preparation and persistence, that story of the bicycle that he shared in the interview. I thought that was interesting. But is it possible that an upcoming conversation might be the thing that changes everything for you? Is it possible that if you just stick with this, that can make all the difference for you? I think so. I would say this book is not necessarily a must read, but I think it's a good read. I think you'll walk away from it with ideas that, that you'll be like, hey, I learned something here and I'll be able to apply it. And as I mentioned in the wrap of the interview, I think you'll also find it to be a hopeful and inspiring read. If you pick up a copy, I'd love to know what you think. You can reach me at show@peopleandprojectspodcast.com, whether from the book or, as Adrian mentioned, he's got an audio version of this as well, or today's discussion. I'd love to hear what resonated with you. If you like more on this topic, I put links in the show notes to episode 458, more recent episode, with Elizabeth Lotardo. And it's a book about how do you find more joy and meaning and opportunities. So you could read that as success in the job you already have. So I think it's an interesting discussion. Way back in episode 402 with Eduardo Brasino, he's an expert on growth mindset. And I feel like that discussion had some really practical applications and discussion around what does that really, really mean? Beyond the headlines, what does it mean? Also, episode 283 with Tom Rath. He's the StrengthsFinder guy. It's an interesting book. This wasn't about the StrengthsFinder. It was about, what are some questions to ask regarding success and leaving a legacy? Tom's a really insightful guy. I think you'll enjoy that episode. Then finally, episode 261 with David Epstein. He wrote a book called Range. I thought about that book so many times, even in the discussion in this episode. David's a brilliant writer and also a fair amount of sports analogies and history, somewhat like Adrian does in his book as well. But so many ideas in the book about how to look at our careers and success. I think it's valuable, that Range book, at any stage of someone's career, just like I think about Adrian's book. But in particular, I think if we can get these ideas loaded in early in our career, I think that would actually help a lot. So strongly recommend those episodes, and I've got links in the show notes for those. So let me just say this. There are so many podcasts you could be listening to, right? So thank you for taking time to listen to the People and Projects podcast. It really is an honor to us to put these together. So on behalf of me and my team, thank you for listening.